another fun hat today. And if there's one thing that I've learned from wearing this hat today, it is that my grandfather, who was in the Navy, had a smaller head than I have. Yes, this is the hat that my grandfather had when he was serving in the Pacific. He got to see lots of the places in Australia and the Philippines. And in this video, we're going to be looking at the final years of the war in the Pacific. And in the next video, we're going to look at the final bombing of Japan. The United States Marines began the process of what they called island hopping all the way back in 1942 when they took Guadalcanal and faced fierce resistance from the Japanese garrisoned there. What you see here is the Solomon Islands, more to the right, New Guinea a little bit to the left, and if you pulled out, you'd see Australia down below to the south. And this is the beginning of a series of island hopping campaigns that the Marines undertook, supported by the Navy and the Air Force, as part of a grand plan to retake a lot of what Japan had either taken or threatened in their early expansion in the 1940s. For years before Pearl Harbor, the United States had worked out a war plan which was called War Plan Orange. In this picture you see officers at the Navy War College putting markings on the floor to represent the vast Pacific Ocean. And actually, for more than a decade before World War II started, American officers had studied the problem of a potential war in the Pacific, and the Japanese threat was coded as an orange color on their maps. So the war plan was orange. So when the fighting broke out in World War II, the United States military leaders, especially the Navy, already had a lot of thoughts about how to pursue this war, and War Plan Orange was the basis for what ended up happening. As we see now here on the larger map, the United States strategy had a couple of elements. One was to use the Navy, and especially submarines, to restrict Japanese shipping. As you can imagine, as an island nation especially, Japan relied heavily on having dominance on the ocean in the Pacific, especially in the parts of the Pacific just south of Japan. Next, the United States wanted to recapture islands in the South Pacific, especially taking away the threat to Australia. As you can see at the maximum expansion, the Japanese had even taken parts of New Guinea, which is very close to Australia. And the United States wished to retake the Philippines, which the Japanese had taken from the United States, as well as many other small islands. Another major goal of the United States was to keep China in the war. General Stilwell was sent to help in that effort, working with the Chinese leader Chiang Kai-shek, which was a very difficult assignment. Chiang Kai-shek was the only major Allied leader who did not have solid control of his own country. Basically, as Japan began to invade China, Chiang Kai-shek was already involved in fighting a civil war against Chinese communists. And they kind of took a break from that during World War II and then went back, and the communists ended up winning. And then finally, the United States wanted to be able to use heavy bombing of Japan once this was possible. At the outset, that was not possible because there was no U.S. air bases near enough to Japan. If you remember, the only bombing possible was from medium bombers launched from an aircraft carrier in the Doolittle raid, not a really sustainable tactic. So what the United States really wanted was land bases within range so that four-engine heavy bombers could begin to pummel the Japanese home islands. As the Marines take more ground in the Pacific, this will eventually be possible. So the naval campaign was one of the great successes of the U.S. Navy in the Pacific, and really ever. It's one of the most extensive and successful submarine campaigns ever carried out. And they made a movie about it starring Ronald Reagan and Nancy, soon or later known to be Nancy Reagan. So long before they were in the White House, you could see them starring in movies together, celebrating this part of the war.
Okay, Landon, let's talk. What I've got to say to you can't be said to a commanding officer.
Must be a big push this time, Gase.
The Admiral told me not to tell.
The Admiral should have told me not to worry.
I thought we'd settled all that about you and me.
It won't stay settled, Case. Not until you tell me you stopped caring.
Landon, there's a Japanese merchantman just heading into the Straits.
What are our orders, Captain?
Here's our chance to log every inch of that channel right into the Sea of Japan. Fire 7.
So this is the part of the war where my grandfather, Jack Dinsmore, comes into the picture. He served on the ship pictured here, the USS Antietam, which was a submarine tender tasked with servicing the submarine fleet as the submarines attacked Japanese shipping in the Pacific. The Antietam served in the last 3 years of the war, and you can see it here with quite a few submarines docked up next to it. My grandfather was an electrician and served by doing a lot of maintenance on these submarines in the fleet in the Pacific. You can see him pictured there on the left. He was about in his early 30s when he was in the Navy, and the pictures on the right are some of his Navy buddies on their ship. I think one of the main takeaways for him was getting to play golf in Australia, as depicted here. There's quite a few pictures he took of golf courses somewhere in Australia. I think the censors would not have allowed him to tell his family where exactly when he took this picture. The Navy got an upgrade as far as its aircraft. As you recall, in the beginning of the war, the Japanese aircraft were superior, flying the Zero. By mid-war, the United States had gotten a hold of the F-6F Hellcat, a carrier-based plane that was superior to the Zero, and then a little after that, the F-4U Corsair, one of the most superb aircraft carrier-based fighters to ever fly. The Corsair actually served well after World War II in different navies and air forces. As the war came to the final years, the Japanese increased the use of what are called kamikaze attacks, or attacks in which the Japanese pilot would fly his plane deliberately into enemy ships. Usually ships were the target. This was a tactic that only the Japanese used. No other country used suicide attacks as a concerted strategy. Certainly, there were times when soldiers or pilots from other nations would end up deliberately crashing into targets, but only the Japanese made it into a deliberate strategy, training up and preparing squadrons of pilots specifically for this mission. And there was a lot of religious ritual and significance to these missions for the Japanese. This is footage of some of the Japanese pilots who were given any aircraft still available and sent on one-way missions. Pilots would fly in waves and seek to crash into the American ships, especially aircraft carriers. This gave a lot of trouble for the American anti-aircraft gunners, who were deeply traumatized by seeing planes fly so recklessly into their fleet. It did lead to the deaths of a number of American sailors and the loss of quite a few ships, although not at a rate that the United States was not able to replace the losses. The kamikaze attacks were some of the bitterest fighting over the Pacific in the Second World War. By February of 1945, the U.S. Marine Force landed on the Japanese-held island of Iwo Jima. The fighting on this island was particularly fierce, costing the Marines 7,000 dead. Even more terrifying, of the 21,000 Japanese defenders, something like 200 survived. This was a result of the Japanese approach to war, in which it was far more honorable to die than to surrender. And there were even instances where the Japanese would instruct civilian populations on islands to kill themselves rather than face capture or occupation, telling civilians that the Americans would do terrible, terrible things to them. This, of course, was not true, but it was a cruel deception on the part of the Japanese government, which led to the deaths of millions as the Marines island hopped closer and closer to the Japanese home islands. You can see here Iwo Jima, very small island, although it is very close to the home islands of Japan. The island was heavily defended with a network of bunkers and tunnels, which meant that the Marines had to fight mile by mile, or yard by yard in some cases, finding these heavily defended, very well camouflaged bunkers. Flushing the Japanese out of these bunkers was a very difficult and dangerous job. Extensive use of things like flamethrowers were employed, one of the most dangerous weapons in the war, both to hold and to have used against you. Here you can see examples where Marines would have to rush up to bunkers, getting in close range to use flamethrowers, oftentimes flamethrowers being the only way to effectively clear out a bunker. Those who were killed in bunkers with flamethrowers were as often killed through burning itself as through asphyxiation. As the flames in the bunkers consumed the oxygen, it would often leave none left for anyone hiding deeper in a tunnel. These were even mounted on tanks, and when available, that was a very great help to the Marines. The Marines took very heavy losses, paying a high price for this and the other islands they took. Although a number did survive, it is always been remembered as one of the toughest battles the Marine Corps ever fought in its history.
This is Staff Sergeant Alvin Josephi, Jr., a United States Marine Corps combat correspondent speaking from Iwo Jima. An attack is underway, and so far this morning, in a couple of hours, they have gone approximately 500 yards through the most difficult kind of terrain. This island is studded with pillboxes, and they have already passed through several lanes of them and have passed over the volcanic ash, the terrible yellow, craggy, rocky, lifeless soil of this part of the island. Whoops, some bullets are whistling past us. We are in the open. Japanese mortars and also small arm fire are occasionally dropping around us. This is very near the front, and there is quite a bit of fire going on around here. The roar you hear in the background, our planes are coming from our own planes that are assisting the infantry just up ahead of us. It is a tremendously well-fortified island. I compare it to the Siegfried Line or one of those fortified lines in Europe, except that this is the entire island studded with such a line. Well, this is a moment at Iwo Jima. It is what the men are living under in their foxholes here. When you go to bed in your foxhole at night, you lie awake usually for hours listening to this. Now, this is Staff Sergeant Alvin Josephi Jr. concluding this broadcast from Iwo Jima.
As you can see from that footage, the fighting was quite intense, and as the battle was being won by the Marines, this iconic picture was taken of soldiers raising the American flag on the top of Mount Suribachi, the high point on the island, which has gone down as one of the most famous images of the war in the Pacific. As the U.S. strategy would dictate, the islands that have been captured were then used to base long-range bombers in order to strike at the Japanese home islands themselves. Iwo Jima didn't become one of the main bases, although it was useful as a place for aircraft to land if they were experiencing trouble on their way to or from Japan. But many other islands, the Philippines, the Marianas, and so forth, were turned into enormous air bases. Islands that were almost uninhabited almost overnight became like mini U.S. cities, hosting hundreds and hundreds of the United States heavy bombers. As you can see from this chart showing the range of a B-29, the reach of the Air Force soon encompassed the southern parts of Japan, including Tokyo, which will be heavily bombed in 1945, starting in March. In the next video, we will describe the bombing campaign in greater detail, this photograph taken shortly after the first major bombing of Tokyo in March 1945. As the United States began approaching the Japanese homeland itself, the prospect of an invasion of Japan loomed, and military planners began to prepare for a potential amphibious invasion of Japan itself. Planners estimated that, based on the casualties sustained in battles like Iwo Jima, an invasion of Japan itself may lead to up to 500,000 American casualties, dwarfing the casualties already sustained by the United States military in Europe and elsewhere in the Pacific. With this potential loss of life, the United States was eager to find a way to end the war more quickly and with less loss of life. And in this way, they turned to air power. In other words, the use of technology to save American lives, a strategy that the United States has continued to employ in its warfare ever since. In the next video, we will talk about the use of air power in the bombardment of Japan, how it successfully allowed the Americans to avoid a land invasion of Japan, but also how these types of air raids soon became very controversial. This will lead us into our debate about the use of bombing on civilian centers.
Over there, send the word, over there, that the Yanks are coming, the drums coming everywhere. So prepare, say a prayer, send the word to beware. We'll be over, we're coming over.